What caused the crash? Nobody saw it coming. September 2008 is often remembered as a moment when the world suddenly woke up to chaos. But in reality, it was the moment when denial finally collapsed under its own weight. Lehman Brothers, a pillar of Wall Street with over 150 years of history, filed for bankruptcy. Within days, global markets plunged into freefall. Credit markets froze. Banks stopped trusting one another. ATMs were quietly monitored for fear they would stop dispensing cash. The global financial system, something most people had assumed was permanent, stable, and self-correcting, teetered on the edge of total annihilation. Governments scrambled behind closed doors, central bankers worked through the night, and ordinary people stared at screens as retirement accounts evaporated in real time. And as the dust began to settle, one question echoed across every newsroom, parliament, and dinner table on Earth. How did this happen? The official answer came quickly and confidently. Politicians blamed complexity. Regulators blamed bad actors. Economists blamed models that failed. Experts insisted the crisis was unforeseeable, an unpredictable convergence of events, a so-called once-in-a-lifetime shock. Nobody saw it coming, they said. But that statement was not merely incorrect. It was a deliberate lie. People did see it coming. Many of them spent years shouting warnings into what felt like an endless void. They published reports, testified before committees, wrote letters, and placed bets that would ultimately ruin their careers or reputations before vindicating them. They were ignored, mocked, dismissed as pessimists, conspiracy theorists, or professional doomsayers. Because the system does not reward those who tell the truth too early, it rewards those who keep the illusion alive just a little longer, those who insist everything is fine, those who keep the party going until the very moment the music stops. And when it finally does stop, the crash is always far worse than anyone is prepared to admit. The pattern is always the same. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to rewind far beyond 2008 and recognize that financial crises are not anomalies. They are features. They follow a rhythm as old as markets themselves, a predictable cycle of human behavior driven by greed, fear, denial, and power. The Roaring Twenties offer a perfect example. In the aftermath of World War I, the United States emerged as an economic powerhouse. Industrial production surged, consumer credit expanded, and stock markets soared. Ordinary Americans, many of whom had never owned financial assets before, poured into the market with borrowed money. Margin debt exploded as investors bought stocks using leverage, convinced that prices could only go up. The idea that prosperity was permanent became a cultural belief, reinforced by newspapers, bankers, and politicians who had every incentive to keep optimism alive. In October 1929, Irving Fisher, one of the most respected economists of his time, declared that stock prices had reached what appeared to be a permanently high plateau. His words carried enormous authority, and they reassured millions. Days later, the market collapsed. What followed was not merely a downturn, but the Great Depression, mass unemployment, bank failures, breadlines, and social unrest that reshaped global politics for decades. Fisher himself lost his fortune, his credibility, and his place in history. But the most important detail is rarely emphasized. People had warned about this. Economists like Roger Babson repeatedly cautioned that speculation had become detached from reality, that debt levels were unsustainable, and that a reckoning was inevitable. He was dismissed as a prophet of doom, a crank who simply didn't understand the new era. Until he was proven right. The pattern was already clear. Euphoria gives way to denial, denial gives way to panic, and panic ends in collapse. Fast forward to the late 1990s, and the same psychological script played out again during the dot-com bubble. The Internet promised to change everything, and in many ways it did. But financial markets turned that promise into madness. Companies with no profits, no viable business models, and sometimes no revenue at all were valued at billions of dollars. Names like Pets.com, Webvan, and Cosmo became symbols of excess. Alan Greenspan, then chairman of the Federal Reserve, warned as early as 1996 about irrational exuberance, but markets ignored him. For 4 more years, valuations climbed higher, fueled by cheap credit and blind faith. When the bubble finally burst in 2000, more than $5 trillion in market value vanished. Millions lost their savings. Once again, the official narrative claimed nobody could have predicted it. But once again, that was untrue. Then came 2008, the most devastating financial crisis since the Great Depression. Subprime mortgages were handed out to borrowers who could not afford them, often with zero down payments and falsified income documentation. These loans were bundled into complex financial products, collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, and sold to investors who relied on flawed ratings and blind trust. Credit default swaps were layered on top, creating a vast, opaque web of interconnected risk. Analysts like Michael Burry, Steve Easman, and Nouriel Roubini warned that the system was unsustainable. They were ridiculed, labeled Dr. Doom, permabears, alarmists who simply didn't understand an innovation. And then the system collapsed almost overnight. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes with terrifying consistency. The lie of the black swan. After every crisis, the same intellectual escape hatch appears, the black swan. Nassim Nicholas Taleb popularized the term to describe rare, unpredictable events with massive consequences. The concept is useful when applied correctly, but it has been grotesquely misused to absolve responsibility. Most financial crashes are not black swans. They are the inevitable result of reckless behavior compounded over time. A true black swan is something like the 2011 Fukushima earthquake, a 9.0 magnitude quake triggering a tsunami and a nuclear meltdown, an extreme event beyond reasonable forecasting. But a housing bubble fueled by subprime lending, leverage, and fraudulent documentation is not unpredictable. It is a ticking time bomb with a visible countdown clock. The 2008 crisis was not a surprise. It was a known risk that was systematically ignored because acknowledging it would have required stopping the party. Banks were making enormous profits. Governments were enjoying tax revenues. Homeowners felt richer. Investors demanded returns. Everyone benefited until they didn't. And today the same logic is being applied once again as the world drifts into what many now call the everything bubble. The everything bubble. Look around the global economy today, and the signs are unmistakable. Stock markets hover near all-time highs despite sluggish productivity growth. Real estate prices have reached record levels in many countries, far outpacing wages. Corporate debt sits at historic peaks, while government debt exceeds 120% of GDP in numerous advanced economies. Asset prices have become detached from underlying economic fundamentals, floating on a sea of liquidity rather than real growth. This did not happen by accident. It was engineered deliberately by central banks responding to crisis after crisis. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and others have engaged in the largest monetary experiment in human history. Quantitative easing, zero interest rates, even negative interest rates became the norm. Trillions of dollars were created out of thin air and injected into financial markets to prevent another depression. In the short term, it worked. Markets stabilized, banks survived. Economies avoided total collapse. But the long-term cost was profound: massive asset inflation, soaring inequality, and a financial system addicted to cheap money. Zombie companies, businesses that cannot survive without constant refinancing, were kept alive. Risk was systematically mispriced, and now the drug is being withdrawn. Interest rates are rising. Quantitative easing has ended. Quantitative tightening has begun. The financial system, which has spent more than a decade on life support, is being asked to stand on its own again. and the question looming over everything is simple: what happens next? The debt trap. To understand the danger, consider a single number: $300 trillion. That is the approximate total global debt as of 2023, encompassing governments, corporations, and households. Global GDP, by contrast, is roughly $100 trillion. In other words, the world owes about 3 times what it produces in a year. This debt was manageable only because interest rates were near zero. Governments could borrow endlessly, corporations could refinance without pain, and households could stretch themselves thin. But debt does not disappear. It must be serviced. When interest rates rise, the math becomes brutal. $1 trillion of debt at 1% interest costs $10 billion a year. At 5%, it costs $50 billion. That extra $40 billion must come from somewhere: investment cuts, layoffs, higher taxes, or reduced consumption. Multiply that dynamic across the global economy, and the result is a massive deflationary shock. Companies default. Banks face losses. Governments struggle to fund basic services. The cycle begins again, not because of a mystery, but because the structure itself is unstable. The 2008 repeat. The parallels to 2008 are impossible to ignore. Before the last crisis, subprime mortgages were bundled into opaque securities and sold to investors who did not understand the risk. Today, corporate debt is bundled into collateralized loan obligations and sold under the same assumptions. Before 2008, banks operated with leverage ratios of 30-1. Today, private equity and hedge funds often exceed 50-1. Before 2008, too big to fail banks were interconnected through derivatives. Today, those banks are even larger, with an estimated $600 trillion in notional derivatives exposure globally. Before 2008, central banks kept rates too low for too long. Today, they kept them at zero for over a decade, inflating the largest speculative bubble in history. All the pieces are in place. The only unknown is the trigger nobody sees. Imagine a seemingly isolated event. A mid-sized European bank announces massive losses tied to commercial real estate. Office buildings sit empty as remote work becomes permanent. Property values collapse. The bank's capital evaporates. Regulators intervene. Markets initially shrug it off as contained, but trust begins to erode. Depositors quietly move their money. Other banks sell assets to raise liquidity. Prices fall. Margin calls trigger forced selling. What begins as a localized problem becomes a systemic one. Central banks intervene, but public trust is gone. Political backlash prevents bailouts. One failure leads to another. Credit freezes. Companies can't make payroll. Unemployment spikes. The crash arrives, and once again the world asks how nobody saw it coming. The invisible fragilities. The financial system today is riddled with invisible fragilities. Derivatives markets so complex that counterparty risk cannot be accurately measured, shadow banking systems operating beyond regulation, algorithmic trading capable of triggering flash crashes in seconds, and cybersecurity threats that could paralyze markets overnight. Events like the 2010 flash crash, the 2021 GameStop short squeeze, and the 2023 collapse of Silicon Valley Bank are not anomalies. They are warning signs. Each time, regulators apply Band-Aids, but the core problem remains untouched: a system built on debt, leverage, and the assumption that central banks will always intervene. The currency crisis. This leads to the ultimate dilemma. Inflation surged in 2021 and 2022, forcing central banks to raise rates aggressively. But inflation remains stubborn. Supply chains are fragile, energy prices volatile, wages rising. Central banks face an impossible choice: keep rates high and risk financial collapse, or cut rates and risk destroying the currency. History shows where this leads. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Each printed money to escape debt, and each destroyed its currency in the process. The belief that it can't happen here, rests entirely on trust. And trust is fragile. The end game? The likely scenario is not a single dramatic collapse, but a grinding crisis. A financial shock leads to more stimulus. Inflation reignites. Currencies weaken. Living standards fall. Social unrest spreads. Geopolitical rivals accelerate. De-dollarization. Confidence erodes. Something eventually breaks. The exact trigger does not matter. What matters is that the system is fragile, interconnected, and built on eroding trust. And when it finally collapses, officials will say, nobody could have predicted it. They will call it a black swan, a perfect storm. But you will know better. The signs were always there. The data was always there. The warnings were always there. The real question is not whether the crash will happen. The real question is whether you will be ready when it does.